And I would like to echo that sentiment on behalf of our church. To all of our veterans, we say thank you. I think back to my childhood and early teen years that, there was a lot of things that I wasn't proud of my father, but I always was proud that he was a veteran. So to all of our veterans, we say thank you. Last week we began a series that we're calling Average. It's about we're wanting to be more than average. Average to me has always been an interesting word. It's something that we need in our vocabulary. It's an idea or theme we need to know about. But I don't know anyone who just wants to be average. And it's important for us as Christians that we don't want to be just average. We want to be more than average for this one reason. Average doesn't cut it. Average is just not going to make you the father you need to be for your children, to prepare them for a world out there, to prepare them for salvation and bring the story to them. Average is not going to make you the husband you need to be, or the wife you need to be, or the Christian teen that you need to be. It's just not going to get it done. But it takes more than just wanting to be more than average to be more than average. It takes getting rid of some things in our lives, and it means taking hold of some new things in our lives. Like last week we talked about our past cannot be, we can't let the past continue to paralyze us so that we don't move forward with our lives and our Christian lives now. We must deal with our past. And today has a little bit of that same thought in it. Today I want us to look at an area that we have to deal with if we intend to be used by God in a more than average way. Have you ever heard the phrase, he's full of himself? He'll say, oh, he's just full of himself. And no matter how you use that phrase, a lot of times we use it jokingly when somebody's really cutting up with us, oh, he's full of himself today. But when you look at where that phrase came from, it means that he's full of arrogance or pride. He thinks he knows everything, all of these things. Seriously, to be more than average, we have to deal with ourselves. We can't be full of ourselves because there's no room for God if we're that way. Now, I want to talk about this using the illustration and life of one of the biblical giants. And we want to talk about Moses. And his story is found in Exodus. So if you want to go ahead and turn there, second book in the Old Testament, we're going to spend most of our time right there. Moses had an unbelievable beginning to life. His story begins in Exodus chapter 2. And as you're turning there, I'm going to go ahead and set the tone with those first two verses of Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Now, a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. Now, what mother has not looked at their child and said, now that's a fine baby? But she realized in some, whether God-given way or whatever, she realized that there was something special here, and that there was a special calling for his life. And it says that so she hid him for 3 months. You see, Moses was born during a very difficult time. The Hebrews, the Israelites, were slaves in the land of Egypt. And their numbers had grown so much that the Egyptians were glad they had all these slaves, but they began to notice they're starting to outnumber us. If they ever rebel, we're going to be in trouble. So they started a national campaign so that the number of Hebrews wouldn't increase so much. And so they passed a law that all baby boys that were born had to be thrown into the Nile River. And we know what would happen there. They would drown, be eaten by crocodiles. And so that was what they were to do. And when she didn't want to sacrifice her child, she hid him at home for 3 months. Can you imagine hiding the birth of a child and then keeping him at home for 3 months and no one finding out? And she knew she couldn't do this forever. So she came up with a plan, and she made a basket and covered it with tar so it would so the water wouldn't seep through. And she put her baby child Moses into this basket and set it among the reeds there on the Nile River. And then she sent her daughter Miriam to keep watch to see what was going on. So in Exodus 2 verses 5 and 8, we see what happened. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. Verse 6, she opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh, she just appears, it says, asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Yes, go, she answered, and the girl went and got the baby's mother. So pretty good deal. She saves her baby. They go and get somebody, and it just so turns out that Miriam goes and gets her mom. Now, you can believe this is all by chance, that this plan came together, or you can believe that it was a very smart mother who had 3 months to come up with a plan. And she knew the habits of Pharaoh's daughter and what she would do, and prayed that it would work out this way. And you also had the protection of God. Moses may have had a tough start, but he had a royal raising. Moses was named by Pharaoh's daughter when you read the story further. Moses means drawn out of the water, and she named him Moses. It says, even uses the word, she adopted him as her own son. But Moses' birth mother, she raised him as well. So he had the influence of being an Egyptian prince, but he also had the influence of a Hebrew mother and family. Stephen, in the New Testament, Acts chapter 7, when he was preaching, referred back to Moses when he said this in Acts 7:22. It says, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. This is a story of rags to riches. It's a Hollywood story. Somebody should make a movie about this guy's life. But as we all do, we grow up and we start making decisions on our own and for ourselves. And Moses does the same, and he makes one here that will alter his life forever. Going back to Exodus chapter 2, verse 11 and 12 says this. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. Now, another place it tells us he was 40 years old at this. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now, it's very safe to assume that he learned his true identity and what his nationality, where he came from his family, from his mother and his sister. But even though he lived in Pharaoh's palace. And Acts chapter 7 goes on and sheds some different light. It says that Moses was defending this Hebrew slave, and that's why he stepped in to do this. But no matter how you look at this story, how you come down on this, the course that he chose could not have been any more wrong. Of what Moses chose to do here. Moses did what a lot of us do. If you'll think about it, he did what a lot of us do. He used his own rationalization to seek the accomplishment of a divine order or objective. He used his own insight and perspective to accomplish a legitimate goal. Moses felt a calling on his life to deliver the Hebrew people, but he badly miscalculated how to accomplish that. And you and I see that all the time. We see that in the lives of people all the time. We love our children, so we want to do the best that we can for our children. But you have to be so careful that in our desire to do the best for our children and provide for them the best and better than what was provided for us, that we don't push God out of the way, that we don't forget His counsel and what He says of how we are to raise our families, that God gets left out, and in the end we end up damaging our families more than we help them. Everyone wants love. Everyone wants to be loved. There's nothing wrong with that. But too many people, in that desire to have a relationship with someone, leave God out of it. Take a godly plan, but leave God out of it, and they find love in the wrong order of things. And it leads to a lot of hurt, a lot of strife, a lot of broken hearts. All of us want to provide for our families, but we end up working so many hours that we neglect our families. You see, Moses wasn't the only one who wanted to accomplish something great, but went about it terribly wrong. Now, the evidence of Moses' miscalculation came to light the very next day. Some of the ones we do, it takes decades before it shows up. But in Exodus 2, verses 13 and 14, we see this. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" And I'm sure that the color went out of his soul right then, and the sweat began to pop out. What he thought was a secret apparently was out. He did not gain the respect of the Hebrews. He lost it. And he also gained the ire or anger of the Egyptians. Look at verse 15. When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian. This is a country far away. Moses' world was gone now. He couldn't go back to the Hebrews. He couldn't go back to the palace. All he could do was run, and that's what he did. He finds a home in Midian, meets a woman, marries there, has a family, but for the next 40 years, he lives and works as a shepherd. Life went on, but his dream died there in Midian. Moses was well-intentioned, he really was, but he didn't grasp that you can't do the right thing the wrong way. You can't do a godly plan and leave God out of it. With God, timing and turf and the way he does things is everything. Now let's just get right to the point here of what the problem is. The problem is there was too much Moses and not enough God. There was too much Moses and not enough God. He may have been educated by the finest universities in the world. He may have been instructed by a godly mother and father, raised to know those things, but he made the decisions based on what he thought. He made the decision to do this on what he thought was best. Moses acted in a physical world, not a spiritual world. And it comes down to a lack of humility when we act this way. When our plans get ahead of God's plans, to bow to God's ways or to seek his ways, if there's too much of you, too much of me, and not enough of God, it is a recipe for trouble and pain. Just listen to a couple of these Proverbs. Proverbs 11:2. When pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. Proverbs 29:23. A man's pride brings him low, but a man of lowly spirit gains honor. Do you see the play here? You see his play? He says, whenever you exalt yourself, he says, you're going to be brought low. He says, but when you bring yourself lowly before God, when you humble yourself before God, he said, God's going to lift you up. He's going to exalt you. Now, when you see this emblem here on the screen, you know, I'm sure some different things come to your mind. For some, I don't even know what that means. Some would say, oh, that's the National Football League, and I think of my favorite team. But over the last 18 months, there's something else that comes to our minds, and that's the national anthem protest. Now, listen real close to what I say, because I'm just using this as an illustration. I'm not saying what they're doing is right, because I think that's the stupidest way you could ever protest something. But think about this. Here's some players who are upset about something and they want to bring attention to it. And they choose to do it during the national anthem when the whole country is watching. And instead of bringing light to the problem, they alienate over half of the nation in doing it. Now, I'm just going to pretend that the thing that they're protesting, the thing they're bringing, was a good thing. I'm just going to pretend that. I don't care how good it is, if you do it the wrong way, you lose. And for us as Christians, we make the same mistake that players in the NFL have made. We know God's plan. We say, oh, that's a good plan. I need that. But then if we do it in the wrong order, we do it the wrong way, we bring disgrace on ourselves, on other Christians, and on the cause of Christ. It's God's turf. It's God's timing. It's His plan. And we need to learn to do that in the order, in the way that He would have us do it. Now let's jump ahead 40 years here. He's been in Midian for 40 years, sheep herder, and he's out herding, tending sheep here, and he sees a burning bush. He goes over to it, and God says this in Exodus chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. If 40 years in Midian, in the wilderness, herding sheep, having to flee and run from your homeland and all of your people, hadn't humbled him, this did. To stand before God in such a way. This is basically a moment that God has provided for Moses to basically say this: are you ready to listen? Are you ready to take my plan and do it my way, not your way? Are you ready? And Moses' answer was a resounding yes. I'm ready to listen to you. You see, and if you go on and read, you see Moses has swung the other way. Back 40 years ago, he was full of himself. And now he's so low on confidence that God has to build him back up. He has to build him back up to say, no, Moses, you're my man. You can do this. But he doesn't say great things about Moses. He tells him all the great things about himself, about God, about the plan. And that's what, instead of building self-confidence, he builds God confidence. And I love it when Moses says, well, I went and tried this before, and they said, who are you? And if I go back now and say, I'm here to deliver you, who do I say sent me? And this is one of the best answers in the whole Bible. Exodus 3:14. God said to Moses, he said, you tell them, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. That's good. That's good. And that should be enough for us as well, to say that God's ways, God, the great I am, has come up with this plan. It's not about more self-confidence. It's about God confidence. But to have room in this old soul and this old being of Greg here, I got to get rid of me to make room for God. I'll never have these moments unless I get rid of a lot of me and my pride and my arrogance. Let's close out with this. Moses lost everything because he trusted in his own plan. His pride and his arrogance got in the way. 40 years later, God calls him to go back and do the original job he had already planned for him to do. When Moses humbled himself before God and said, your timing, your turf, your plan. I don't think I'd really ever noticed this in this story. I can't tell you how many times in my life I've read this story. I don't think I'd really ever noticed this. But during the time after Moses has gone back to Egypt and he's dealing with Pharaoh and they've brought one plague after the other, and right when they're down to bring the final plague, it says this in Exodus 11:3. The Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people. And that's just saying God was working behind the scenes to bring this about. And here it is. And Moses himself was highly regarded in Egypt by Pharaoh's officials and by the people. I think I'd missed that. Moses left in disgrace, had to live as a fugitive. But now when he humbled himself, he goes back respected by the people. Not only just the Israelites, the ones he's there to help, the ones he's working against respected him because they saw what he was about. And it's not just for Moses, it's for you and I as well. 1 Peter 5:6, Simon Peter said this, he says, "Humble yourselves therefore under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time." See, God wants us to have a burning bush moment where we finally have recognized that we're going to empty ourselves of ourselves and we're going to bow before God and recognize nothing between us and God, not even the half inch of shoe leather on the sandals. Nothing between us and God because I've got myself out of the way. He wants us to be exalted. He wants us to be lifted up. He wants our lives to be respected for what they are. Even if people don't agree with us as Christians, are saying that they respect us for how we live. God wants us to be more than average. But we've got to get rid of the old self.